For 4 months, my wife refused to touch me. Said she was too tired. Then at 1 a.m., I saw the blue glow from her phone bouncing off her pillow. She was texting someone. I'm head of cybersecurity. I pulled the logs. The number saved as HR department belonged to our CFO. Seattle rain doesn't actually fall, it just hovers around you like a silent accusation. And on that particular Tuesday night in October, I could feel every molecule of that damp air pressing through the walls of our $3 million smart home while I lay flat on my back at 1:45 in the morning, staring at the ceiling like it had answers I hadn't asked for yet. My name is Ryan Coldwell. I put in 12 years with the Marines before moving into corporate cybersecurity. And I'll tell you this, the silence that can exist between two people sharing a bed at 1 o'clock in the morning hits harder than anything I ever encountered in a combat zone. Emily's back was facing me, same as it had been for 123 nights straight. And before you say anything, yes, I was absolutely keeping count, because that's just how my brain operates when the numbers stop making sense. 9 years of marriage teaches you things you never expected to learn, like the exact rhythm of your partner's breathing when they're actually asleep. And Emily wasn't asleep. Her shoulders were too rigid for that. And there was that unmistakable blue glow bouncing off her silk pillowcase, the one she'd insisted we absolutely needed because regular cotton was apparently beneath us now. She was texting somebody at 1 in the morning and pretending she'd been too wiped out to move. 6 months ago, the version of me from back then would have reached over, touched her shoulder gently, and tried to remind her of who we used to be, two people who couldn't fall asleep without being wrapped up in each other. But I wasn't that guy anymore. I cleared my throat, softly, just enough to signal that I was awake, and spoke to her in that particular careful tone that husbands use when they've learned to treat their own homes like minefields. She didn't flinch. Didn't even fake being startled. She just exhaled this long, heavy sigh, like I'd asked her to climb a mountain rather than simply acknowledge that I existed. I've got an early meeting tomorrow, Ryan, please, she said. And her voice had this quality to it, I can only describe it as a door slamming in your face without anyone physically touching the door. Cold, clipped, irritated, like my presence on my own side of the bed was something she was barely putting up with. 4 months of this, and I'm not talking about the natural rhythm of marriage where sometimes life gets hard and the spark needs a little work. I mean 4 months of my wife treating the idea of touching me like I was carrying something contagious. 4 months of excuses that kept getting thinner and thinner until they were basically see-through. 4 months of watching the woman I'd built everything with slowly become a stranger who just happened to have my last name and use my address. The bed we'd once thought of as our private sanctuary had turned into a no man's land, and she'd made it very clear exactly which side of the line I was allowed to occupy. I got up without another word, because honestly, what was left to say, and made my way to the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was dark except for the soft ambient glow of the smart lighting system I'd installed myself, because engineers do that. We see something that could work better and we fix it. Except whatever had broken between me and my wife was apparently outside my area of expertise. The kitchen calendar caught my eye, and something tightened in my chest when it hit me that today, technically, since it was already past midnight, was the anniversary of our first date. 9 years ago, I'd taken Emily to this small Italian place in the U District, the kind of spot with checkered tablecloths and candles jammed into old wine bottles, and she'd laughed at almost everything I said and looked at me like I was genuinely the most fascinating person she'd ever sat across from. The date wasn't circled on the calendar. She'd either forgotten or stopped caring. And honestly, I wasn't sure which one hurt worse. I didn't sleep. I just sat there in the dark, working through my water and listening to the rain, letting my mind run the way it always does, cataloging patterns, flagging anomalies. Because cybersecurity does something to the way you see the world. You start reading everything as a system. And when any part of a system starts behaving in ways it shouldn't, that's what we call an indicator of compromise. And my marriage, my entire domestic existence, was throwing up red flags like it was trying to win a competition. Morning came wrapped in that flat gray Seattle light that makes everything look like an old photograph taken through a foggy lens. I watched Emily get ready for work the way you'd watch surveillance footage, clinically, detached, looking for data. She spent 45 minutes picking out her outfit. That was 20 minutes longer than her baseline. And she was humming to herself, actually humming, like someone who had something genuinely exciting waiting for them. That something clearly wasn't me, and it clearly wasn't our anniversary she'd forgotten to acknowledge. Her phone buzzed on the marble countertop and she was across the room before the second vibration, her entire body language snapping from casual to alert, the way someone moves when they're expecting a message they've been looking forward to. "Client from the Tokyo office?" I asked, keeping my voice completely flat as I sipped my coffee. "Rough deal with the time difference." She glanced up at me with those green eyes I used to think were beautiful and now mostly just read as calculating, and she gave me the professional smile, the one that stops well below her actual eyes. You know how it goes. Global business doesn't take days off. What I knew was that North Peak Energy had shut down their Tokyo operation 6 weeks earlier due to restructuring. What I also knew was that my wife had just looked me dead in the face and lied without the slightest hesitation. And what I knew above everything else was that the woman standing in front of me in her expensive dress and her designer heels was not the same person I had married. She'd become someone else entirely. Someone who looked through me like I was a piece of furniture. Someone who fabricated stories about phone calls, worked implausibly long hours, and came home carrying the scent of someone else's perfume and restaurant food I'd never been invited to share. After she pulled out of the driveway in the BMW she'd insisted we needed because her Lexus was apparently too embarrassing to be seen in at the North Peak garage, I sat down at my home office computer and got to work. I'm the head of cybersecurity at North Peak Energy. That comes with access to things most people don't even know exist, and more importantly, it comes with the skills to locate things that people are convinced they've buried. Some men in my position would have exploded, screamed, broken things, demanded the kind of answers that don't actually change anything. But I wasn't some men. I was a former Marine who'd spent 12 years learning that the first principle of any operation is intelligence. You never show your cards until you're ready to play the hand. First thing I did was pull the GPS data from Emily's company phone, which I had completely legitimate access to as the company's security administrator. What I found was interesting, in the way that things you already suspected being confirmed is a particular kind of interesting. On paper, her phone logged time at the office and at home, right where a dedicated marketing director's phone was supposed to be. But phones are leaky things. They leave traces in places people forget to think about. When I dug into the network logs, I found her phone had been pinging cell towers out near Bellevue on a consistent basis, specifically towers near a boutique hotel called the Silver Bay, the kind of place that's popular with executives who need a certain level of privacy more than they need a corporate discount rate. 40 extra miles a week on her odometer she couldn't account for. Regular visits to a hotel that had nothing to do with any marketing campaign I could find. And restaurant receipts for places serving oysters and champagne, which was notable because Emily had always told me she hated oysters. Said they reminded her of snot. Apparently her palate had changed, or more likely, someone else had been doing the ordering. The pieces started clicking together with the cold, mechanical precision of a puzzle you desperately wish you could stop working on but can't. The new gym habit. The hotel lobby perfume she'd started wearing. The way she'd started calling me Ryan instead of the nickname she'd used for years. The wardrobe upgrades. The late nights. The business trips that didn't line up with anything on her actual schedule. Every single detail was another data point in an equation I didn't want to solve but couldn't stop myself from calculating, because that's the part of my brain I can't turn off. It finds the truth whether I want it to or not. That night I stayed late in the server room at work. Nobody questioned it. I stayed late regularly and the hum of the servers was almost meditative, like white noise for a mind running at full speed. I sat under the blue glow of multiple monitors and pulled up the communication logs for North Peak's corporate phones. As head of security, I had metadata access for compliance and emergency purposes. What I found in those logs made my blood go cold in a way that a combat zone never quite managed. Emily's contact-labeled HR department had been racking up significant activity, which would have been perfectly unremarkable if that number had actually belonged to HR. Instead, it belonged to Nathaniel Blake, our chief financial officer. The kind of guy who wore his success like a weapon, laughed too loud at his own jokes, wore watches that cost more than some people's mortgages, and moved through every room like everyone in it was auditioning for his attention. Nate Blake was also married. 3 kids. A wife who organized charity events and smiled for camera phones at company gatherings with the patient expression of someone slowly figuring out what they'd agreed to. I pulled their message history, and as I read through months of exchanges, I felt something fundamental shift inside me, the kind of deep internal movement you feel in your chest before you consciously understand what's happening. The messages started professionally enough, marketing talk, budget discussions, quarterly projections. Then they evolved, the way these things always do, into something else entirely. Inside jokes. Late night messages. Conversations that made it perfectly obvious they weren't just reviewing spreadsheets over their working dinners. The one that hit me hardest was a message from 3 weeks earlier. My wife, the woman I'd stood in front of and made promises to, had written to her boyfriend, "That old fool Moore won't notice a thing. We can push through another 50 grand before the quarter closes." His response asked about the soldier boy at home, and her reply came back calling me harmless. A nobody who would be out of her life once the bonuses cleared. Harmless. A nobody. There it was in black and white, not suspected, not implied, but documented. The actual truth of how the woman I'd loved for nearly 10 years had come to see me. Not as a husband. Not even as a real obstacle. Just a placeholder. Something warm in the house while she built her actual life somewhere else. I sat in that server room for a long time. Just breathing. Just letting it all land and rearrange itself into something I could actually work with. An earlier version of me, younger, before I'd learned what uncontrolled emotion costs you in dangerous situations, might have driven straight home and detonated the whole evening. But that wasn't who I was anymore. I understood with total clarity that the woman I'd married had been gone for a while already, replaced by someone who viewed me as a line item. And the only real question remaining was what I was going to do about it. Because here's the thing that Emily and her boyfriend had completely miscalculated about me, and honestly, that most people in my life had miscalculated too. The steady, quiet, low-drama guy who came to work every day and did his job without making a scene. The husband who absorbed excuse after excuse without pushing back. That was not weakness. That was discipline. The same discipline that had kept me breathing through situations that would have finished other people. The same discipline that allows you to function when losing your composure means losing your life. And now I was going to put that discipline to work in a different kind of operation, one where I was going to wait, and watch, and build a case so airtight it couldn't be argued with. And when the moment was right, I was going to take apart everything they'd built with the same methodical precision I'd used to dismantle a hostile network. The weeks that followed were a study in controlled deception on my end, me playing the role of the clueless husband while internally filing away every lie, every slip, every piece of evidence that told the real story underneath. I brought her flowers for our anniversary. Watched her fake a smile and explain that she was too tired to go anywhere. Noted the way she checked her phone about 30 seconds after walking away from me. I told her I understood, that we'd celebrate when things settled down, and I caught a flicker of relief in her expression, confirmation that she'd long since stopped considering me someone she needed to worry about. There was one dinner during those weeks that I still remember with painful clarity. Emily had come home late again, citing a marathon session with the European team, and I'd made pasta from scratch because that's always been one of the ways I show up for people I love, and those instincts don't just switch off. She barely looked at the plate when she sat down. More interested in her phone than in the hours I'd put in. "This is nice," she said, completely without feeling, pushing the linguine around like she was looking for somewhere to hide it. "You really didn't have to do all this." "It's not an effort when it's for someone you care about," I said back, watching her face for any sign of guilt or even just basic recognition. I found nothing except poorly masked impatience. She left most of her food and excused herself to take a conference call that ran for 2 hours and, based on the sounds coming through the closed office door, involved a lot of laughter that had nothing to do with conference calls. I cleaned the kitchen alone, boxed up leftovers she would never touch, and sat at the counter thinking about when exactly my marriage had become a performance I was required to attend but never actually part of. The next morning I found a receipt in her coat pocket, one she'd meant to throw away. Dinner for two at a restaurant I'd never heard of. The bill showed champagne, oysters, dessert. The kind of spending that says celebration, not client meeting. The date on the receipt was our anniversary. The same night she'd told me she was too exhausted to do anything but fall into bed. She hadn't just forgotten the date. She'd actively made other plans for it, while I sat home watching the hours go by and telling myself that sometimes work really is that demanding. Meanwhile, I kept digging into the financial records, following the thread of money that Emily and Nate had been so careless about concealing. They'd set up a shell company, a marketing consultancy that existed only on paper, and had been routing inflated invoices through North Peak's advertising budget for the past 18 months. The numbers weren't staggering by corporate standards, but they added up. $2.5 million funneled through fake campaigns, ghost vendors, and creative bookkeeping that would make a forensic accountant weep. And the detail that nearly made me laugh out loud, alone in my server room in the dark, they'd done all of it using company systems, leaving digital fingerprints absolutely everywhere, like two amateurs who'd convinced themselves they were criminal masterminds. But it got worse, and of course it got worse. As I kept pulling threads, I found that Emily hadn't only been stealing money and sleeping with her boss. She'd been actively dismantling other people's careers to clear her own path. Internal emails showed her feeding confidential information about competing VP candidates to Nate, giving him material to tank their projects and make them look incompetent in front of Harold Moore, the company's founder and CEO. People who had worked hard and operated with integrity had their careers derailed because my wife wanted a corner office badly enough to burn anyone standing between her and it. Harold Moore was old money and old values. A self-made billionaire who'd built North Peak from a single Montana gas station into a regional energy empire on the strength of stubbornness and an almost religious commitment to doing things right. The kind of man who still sometimes answered his own phone and could recall by name employees he'd crossed paths with once at a company picnic 3 years back. He was also the kind of man who took betrayal personally, the kind of personally that has consequences. When I finished compiling everything, I knew exactly whose desk it needed to land on. The meeting with Harold happened on a Thursday afternoon in his corner office on the 40th floor, where you could see all of Seattle laid out below like a blueprint of everything he'd built. I walked in carrying a black folder packed with printouts, every email, every transaction, every piece of documentation I'd collected, and set it on his desk without any preamble, because Harold was a man who appreciated getting straight to it. "What's this, Coldwell?" he said, not looking up from his screen. "You putting in for time off or something?" "No sir," I said, keeping my voice steady and professional. "This is an internal security audit documenting potential financial irregularities. Approximately $2.5 million in fraudulent transactions over the past 18 months. That got his full attention. He slowly closed the laptop and looked at me with those gray eyes that had made plenty of opponents sweat across negotiating tables. Harold Moore at 63 still looked like he could handle himself in most situations. There was a reason nobody in the company pushed him twice. "Go on," he said. I laid it out the way I would have briefed a commanding officer, clean, factual, every claim backed by something in the folder. The shell company. The inflated invoices. The paper trail running directly to Nathaniel Blake's personal accounts and from there to a joint fund Emily had access to. The emails where they casually discussed the scheme like they were talking about weekend plans. The communications proving they deliberately undermined other executives to boost Emily's career. And yes, the hotel footage, not because I wanted his sympathy, but because it established the nature of their relationship in a way that gave context to everything else. I'd accessed it through legitimate security channels, the kind of access that technically fell within my role even if I wouldn't normally have had occasion to use it that way. Harold went through the folder page by page, his expression getting harder with each turn. When he finally looked back up at me, I recognized the look on his face from my time in uniform, a man who'd been personally insulted and was already calculating the appropriate response. "Your wife," he said. Not a question. "Yes, sir. Still is, legally. I expect that'll be changing soon." He looked at me for a long moment. I knew what he was checking for, some signal that this was a bitter husband's personal vendetta rather than a legitimate security matter. Whatever he saw in my face must have cleared that concern, because he gave one sharp nod, the kind that means something has been decided. "They picked the wrong man to underestimate, son. They went after someone who knows how to fight without causing a spectacle." He set his hand flat on top of the folder like he was sealing a promise. "The charity gala is Friday. We're going to make an example that this industry won't forget anytime soon." The next 24 hours were a strange suspended state, going through the motions of my life while knowing everything was about to crack open. I went home. Had dinner with Emily. Listened to her narrate her day while knowing that virtually nothing she said was real. She mentioned the gala, said Nate had hinted at a major announcement, and she was practically glowing with anticipation, already picturing the version of Friday night that existed inside her head. "You'll make sure you look presentable, right?" she said, straightening my collar with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone I'd never actually met. "This matters for my career." "Wouldn't dream of embarrassing you," I said. And I meant it in ways she had no way of understanding. Friday arrived with that rare kind of autumn weather Seattle occasionally produces as an apology for all the rain, crisp, clear, almost theatrical. Emily spent the entire day preparing like she was getting ready for her own wedding. Hair salon, nails, makeup artist, the full production. And when she finally emerged in a $3,000 dress purchased with money she'd stolen from the company she pretended to serve, she looked like a magazine cover and felt about as warm as one. I watched her study herself in the mirror for 20 solid minutes, rotating angles, examining details, like she was memorizing the precise coordinates of her own perfection. The vanity had always been in her, I suppose, but it used to come wrapped in self-awareness, moments where she'd catch me watching and laugh at herself. There was no laughter now. Just cold evaluation, like a product being checked before launch. "The emerald earrings or the diamonds?" she asked, holding one against each ear without actually directing the question at me. "The emeralds pick up your eyes," I said automatically, the kind of reflexive answer I'd given hundreds of times. She ignored it entirely and chose the diamonds. "The diamonds are worth more," she explained to her own reflection. As if that were the only relevant metric, which, I suppose, for her, it had become. We drove to the gala separately because Emily said she might need to stay late for networking and I shouldn't feel like I had to wait around. The real reason was she wanted the freedom to leave with Nate without having to construct an explanation. I accepted the excuse the same way I'd accepted all the others. Let her keep believing I was the harmless nobody she'd written off. Let her walk into that ballroom thinking she was the smartest person in the building. The limo ride to the Grand Aurora was an exercise in studied distance, Emily texting the entire way, me watching the city lights slide past the window and keeping my mind deliberately quiet. She didn't notice my silence. Or she noticed and didn't care. Either way, it suited me fine. The man sitting next to her wasn't the husband she'd decided she could manage without. He was something else now, something she'd helped build with every lie and every scheme, and every morning she looked at me and decided I wasn't worth worrying about. I caught our reflection in the tinted glass, two people in formal wear close enough to touch, separated by a distance that had nothing to do with inches. I thought about all the times I'd ridden toward situations where the outcome was uncertain and potentially final. This felt different, but also strangely familiar, that particular stillness that comes before a storm you've spent serious time preparing for. The ballroom at the Grand Aurora was everything you'd expect from a high-end corporate charity event: crystal chandeliers, ice sculptures, servers threading through the crowd with champagne that probably cost more per bottle than a week's groceries for most people. The room was full of investors and board members and executives who all seemed to speak the same private language, the dialect of people who've never had to stress about making rent. Emily transformed the moment we walked through those doors. She became the ideal corporate spouse, poised, magnetic, entirely in her element among people who played exactly the kind of games she'd been playing. I spotted Nate immediately across the room, stationed near the stage with that predatory grin he wore like a badge, looking every inch the polished CFO in his custom suit and his obscenely expensive watch. He caught Emily's eye and gave her a small nod that probably read as innocent to anyone who wasn't actively watching for it. She responded with a slight adjustment of her hair that might as well have been a signal. These two had convinced themselves they were being clever and subtle, when anyone with a functioning brain and a reason to look could read them like a billboard. I spent the cocktail hour making polite conversation with mid-level managers who seemed mildly surprised to discover the cybersecurity director could discuss things unrelated to network architecture. One of them, a woman from accounting named Linda, sharper than her title suggested, asked about Emily with the kind of studied neutrality that told me she probably already had her own suspicions. "Your wife seems to be doing really well," Linda said, watching Emily work the room. "She's certainly made an impression on the executive team." "She has a talent for making impressions," I agreed, keeping my voice perfectly even. And Linda gave me a look that said she understood exactly what I wasn't spelling out. Dinner was an elaborate multi-course affair with the kind of wine pairings that only exist for people on expense accounts. I was seated at a table with board members who spent most of the meal comparing golf scores and discussing vacation homes in Maui. Emily was positioned closer to the stage, flanked by Nate and a couple of other executives who absorbed her every word like she was dispensing rare wisdom rather than running a charm offensive. She glanced at me exactly once during the entire meal, a quick sweep of the eyes to confirm I was still in my designated spot, then returned to her actual audience. The evening moved through its standard paces: speeches about community investment and charitable giving, the usual declarations of commitment to excellence. Emily circulated like someone running for something, introducing herself to board members, laughing at jokes that didn't warrant it, keeping herself in orbit around the stage. She barely registered my presence all night, except to occasionally steer me away from conversations she considered above my station. Around 9 o'clock, Harold Moore stepped up to the stage and the room went quiet in the particular way it does when someone powerful commands attention without trying. He looked distinguished in his tux, the picture of a man who'd earned everything he had, and when he smiled at the crowd there was nothing in his expression to telegraph what was about to happen. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily across the room without any amplification needed. "Tonight we're here to talk about transparency and the direction of this company. But I've always believed you can't build a real future without first being honest about the present." Emily elbowed me in the ribs, her face lit up with anticipation. "This is it," she whispered. "He's announcing the restructuring." I didn't respond. I just watched as Harold nodded to the technician at the AV panel, and the enormous screen behind him blinked to life. Emily went pale so quickly I genuinely thought she might pass out. And from across the room I could see Nate Blake go completely still mid-smile as his own words appeared on a screen the size of a small building, displayed in front of 400 of the most influential people in Seattle's business community. "That old fool Moore won't notice a thing. We can push through another 50 grand before the quarter closes. What about the soldier boy at home? Ryan? He's harmless. A nobody who will be out of my life as soon as the bonuses hit." The silence in that ballroom was total. The kind where you can actually hear the ice shifting in the champagne buckets. And then Harold's voice cut through it like a blade. "These messages," he said, in a tone that was almost conversational, were exchanged between my chief financial officer and my director of marketing over the past several months, as part of a scheme that defrauded this company of over $2 million and deliberately destroyed the careers of several hard-working executives whose only mistake was standing in someone else's way. The screen shifted to financial documents, transaction records, the full paper trail laid out in undeniable detail. A murmur rolled through the crowd like the first tremor before an earthquake, and someone's champagne glass hit the marble floor and shattered with a sound like a starting gun. Then the video appeared. Surveillance footage from the Silver Bay Hotel. Emily and Nate walking through the lobby together, his hand resting low on her back, both of them laughing like people without a care in the world, stepping into an elevator that clearly wasn't taking them to separate floors. The footage was composed enough that it wouldn't air on the evening news, but clear enough in what it showed that nobody in that room could maintain any polite pretense about what they were watching. Nate moved toward the exit, but two security guards stepped into his path like they'd been placed there specifically for that moment, because they had been, since I'd personally briefed them before the event. His expression went from confident predator to pale wreck in approximately 3 seconds, and watching him understand in real time that his entire constructed world was coming apart almost, made up for 4 months of lying awake alone in the dark. Emily grabbed my arm, fingers pressing in hard enough to leave marks, her voice a desperate hiss that she probably intended to be quiet but that carried clearly in the silence around us. Ryan, do something. This is wrong. These are fabricated. Someone set this up. I looked at her, really looked at her, past the flawless makeup and the expensive dress, all the way to the person she'd actually become. The person who'd called me harmless and a nobody in writing, who'd lied to my face every single day for months without flinching, who'd stolen and manipulated and left a trail of damaged people behind her without a moment of visible remorse. And what I felt wasn't anger. It was something quieter than that. A cold, settled clarity that was almost like peace. I'm the head of cybersecurity, Emily, I said, making sure my voice carried to the people standing close enough to catch every word. I personally authenticated every single one of those files. Every one of them is real. I reached down and lifted her hand off my sleeve, slowly and deliberately, the way you'd remove a piece of thread from an otherwise fine jacket. The expression on her face as it finally registered, as she grasped my role in all of this, was something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Not with pride exactly, but with the somber recognition that some things, once done, cannot be walked back. Harold's voice came through the speakers again, formal and final now. Emily Coldwell and Nathaniel Blake are hereby terminated for cause, effective immediately. Their participation in corporate fraud and ethics violations has been reported to the relevant authorities, who are currently waiting in the lobby to continue this conversation. Camera flashes erupted everywhere, a storm of light as every journalist in the room understood they were holding the kind of story that makes careers. Emily stood at the center of it all, the image she'd spent years constructing dissolving in real time around her. Across the room, Nate was being guided toward the exit by security with the kind of firm, practiced grip that made it clear resistance wasn't an option. She turned to me one final time, and I watched the emotions move across her face in sequence, shock collapsing into rage, rage dissolving into something that looked a lot like fear, as she finally understood the full scope of what she'd underestimated. "You did this," she said. Flat. Certain. "You did this," I said back. "I just wrote it all down." The crowd parted as I walked toward the exit, and I didn't look back. Behind me I could hear Emily's voice climbing in pitch as the officers approached, a string of excuses and accusations that nobody around her was paying attention to anymore. But all of it faded to background noise the moment I stepped out into the cool Seattle night and took the first deep breath I'd managed in what felt like a very long time. The next 48 hours were a hurricane of consequences that I watched from a careful remove, like observing a controlled demolition from behind a barrier. Nate's attorney got him out on bail, but his first move was to throw Emily under the bus so thoroughly that their old alliance became a running joke in corporate circles for months. According to his statement, he'd been seduced and manipulated into a scheme he hadn't truly understood, coerced by a woman who'd used her personal appeal to override his better judgment. Which was exactly the brand of spineless deflection I'd expected from a man who'd never voluntarily accepted responsibility for anything. The media coverage was relentless in the way everything is relentless now, every detail picked apart and reassembled and picked apart again until only the outrage and the commentary remain. Someone leaked Emily's corporate headshot, and overnight her face was everywhere, the high-flying executive who had betrayed her company, her husband, and essentially everyone who'd ever done her a favor. The comment sections were predictably brutal, equal parts moral fury and barely concealed satisfaction at watching someone fall from a height they'd worked hard to reach. The colleagues who'd smiled at her in conference rooms and accepted her help with their projects turned on her with a particular ferocity reserved for people who get caught doing what everyone suspected but couldn't prove. The same executives who'd praised her drive and her ambition were suddenly claiming they'd always sensed something was off about her, always knew she was too hungry, too strategic, too willing to step on whatever needed stepping on. The kind of revisionist history that organizations are very good at, everyone rushing to distance themselves from failure while quietly pocketing whatever credit they'd earned from her success. Emily's corporate cards were cut off before she even left the gala. Her accounts frozen as part of the fraud investigation. Her company car flagged for immediate return. By morning, her face was on the front page of every local outlet, and not in the way she'd spent years working toward. The ambitious executive who'd gambled everything on a corner office was now the cautionary tale that HR departments would reference in ethics training for years to come. I got calls from reporters wanting quotes, attorneys wanting depositions, former colleagues wanting gossip dressed up as genuine concern. I didn't engage with most of them. This wasn't a narrative I needed to shape or a story I wanted to own. The documented evidence existed in court filings and financial records and corporate communications that would probably be studied in business ethics programs for a while. She tried to come home that night. Stood out in the rain by the front gate like something out of a movie, except this wasn't a romantic comedy, and there was no heartwarming moment of forgiveness coming. The gate code had already been changed, something I'd taken care of earlier in the day alongside a consultation with a divorce attorney who specialized in asset protection in cases involving spousal fraud. Her belongings were packed in boxes already softening in the Seattle drizzle, designer clothes and expensive shoes and all the physical evidence of a life she'd built on stolen resources and broken trust. I watched her on the security camera for a while. Watched her pound on the gate and then the door. Watched the mascara track down her cheeks in long black lines as the rain turned her from corporate predator into something smaller and harder to look at. There was a time when seeing her in distress would have brought me running, whatever she'd done. That time had passed somewhere between reading those messages and watching her lie to my face with no visible conflict whatsoever. She stood out there for nearly an hour, cycling between pounding on things and slumping against them. I found myself wondering what was actually going through her mind. Whether she was genuinely sorry or just sorry about the outcome. Whether somewhere behind all the calculation there was even a basic understanding of the difference. The rain kept falling, indifferent the way weather always is to human problems, the way life tends to be indifferent to people who've run out of chances they were never paying much attention to. Eventually she pulled out her phone, probably calling one of the friends who would soon discover that association with her had become professionally inconvenient. When I finally opened the door, I stayed on the threshold. The rain was coming down hard now, and Emily looked like a completely different person from the woman who'd spent the entire morning preparing for her own coronation. She reached for me the moment she saw the door open, her voice cracking with an urgency that might have been persuasive if I hadn't spent months cataloging every layer of her deception. "Ryan, please, you have to listen to me," she said, hands shaking, from cold, or fear, or both. "This is all being misread. If you just give me the chance to explain." "There's no we here anymore, Emily," I said, and my own voice sounded strange to me. Steady. Far away. Like I was reporting a weather condition to someone down the street. "There hasn't been one for a long time. You made that very plain in your own words." Those messages were venting. I was stressed. I didn't mean any of it. You know how much pressure I've been under. What struck me most in that moment wasn't her fear or her desperation. It was the fact that she was still doing it. Still lying, still pivoting, still treating me like the harmless nobody from her text messages. Even now, with everything around her in ruins, she couldn't find her way to the truth. Couldn't acknowledge what she'd done without immediately repackaging it as something someone else's fault. Some people never get there, never figure out that the tactics that got them into trouble are not going to be the tactics that pull them back out. I reached behind the door and produced a manila envelope, the kind that feels heavier than it should based purely on what it represents. "Divorce papers," I said, setting them in her hands. "And a restraining order. You're required to stay at least 500 feet from me, from this house, and from my workplace. The house was purchased entirely with my income and my inheritance, so you'll be taking your personal belongings and nothing beyond that." Her face shifted into something harder, the last traces of the charming public persona finally falling away. "You think you can just discard me after everything I put into this marriage?" I almost let that land as funny. Almost let the sheer audacity of it crack my composure. But I held on. "What exactly did you put into this marriage, Emily? An affair with your boss? $2.5 million in company theft? Calling me harmless in writing while you planned your exit? Spending our anniversary with someone else while I sat at home?" I shook my head slowly. "You didn't treat this marriage like something worth protecting. You treated it like overhead. And now you're learning that some losses can't be recovered. You're making a massive mistake," she said, and the warmth was completely gone now, Nothing left but cold venom. I will take you apart in court. I'll walk away with everything. You're welcome to try, I said, and I genuinely meant it. But I'd read those papers carefully before you map out your strategy. My attorney has a very thorough picture of your financial situation, including a few specific transactions that the federal investigators might find worth their time, if they haven't already. The fight left her then, fast, like watching the pressure drop out of a room. She leaned against the doorframe with the envelope held against her chest, and the woman in front of me looked nothing like the executive she'd sacrificed everything to become. I realized, somewhat to my own surprise, that I felt something close to pity. Not because she didn't deserve what was happening, but because I was watching someone arrive at the full weight of their own choices and finally, too late, understand what they'd actually cost. Where am I supposed to go? She asked, and her voice had gone small. That's not something I can answer for you anymore, I said. And I closed the door. The click of the lock sounded like the closing of a chapter. Which is exactly what it was. I stood in the foyer of my empty house and listened to the rain and the muffled sounds of Emily retreating, and I waited for the wave of triumph or vindication, or at the very minimum, satisfaction, to wash over me. What I felt instead was a particular kind of emptiness. The kind you feel when you've been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and finally putting it down leaves you feeling lighter but also strangely unmoored. I went to the living room and poured myself a glass of whiskey from the bottle I'd been saving for a significant occasion without ever quite settling on what that meant. The first sip burned the right way, and I settled into my chair and watched the rain through the glass and let my mind go quiet for the first time in months. There was still plenty ahead, lawyers, paperwork, probably months of legal proceedings before anything was fully resolved, but that was a problem for a future version of me. The present version had done what needed doing, and was now going to sit in the silence and appreciate that it no longer felt like something pressing down on him. The house felt different. Or maybe I was different. Probably both. The traces of Emily's presence were still everywhere, her design choices, the furniture arranged the way she'd arranged it, but they felt like artifacts from a dig site now, evidence of a previous era rather than part of anything living. I'd change things eventually. Make the space mine in the ways I'd never bothered to push for when I was busy accommodating someone who'd already decided she wasn't staying. The weeks that followed came with their full parade of legal proceedings, depositions, and the kind of paperwork that makes you briefly appreciate the efficiency of more direct solutions. Emily's attorney tried every available angle: workplace pressure, controlling husband, a rotating cast of alternative explanations that might have landed if there hadn't been a documented mountain of evidence suggesting otherwise. The fraud investigation grew to include federal charges once the offshore account surfaced, and suddenly Emily's legal situation was significantly larger than a contested divorce. I testified twice, once for the divorce, once for the federal case, and both times I kept my answers short, factual, and completely resistant to any bait designed to get me emotional or speculative. Her legal team tried to frame me as a vengeful husband who'd manufactured a case out of personal spite. But the forensic accountants had validated everything I'd found, and then identified additional items. By the end of the first week of testimony, even her own lawyers appeared to be going through the motions. The hardest part wasn't the legal proceedings, or the media attention, or the occasional hostile run-in with someone who'd bought Emily's version of events. The hardest part was the quiet. Coming home to an empty house and instinctively reaching for my phone to share something about my day, before remembering that the person I'd shared that ritual with for nearly a decade was simply gone. Not dead, just transformed into someone unrecognizable, someone I wouldn't choose to know even if recognition were possible. Nate took a plea deal that came with significant prison time and financial penalties large enough to erase most of what he'd stolen. His cooperation agreement made it impossible for Emily to claim she hadn't understood the full scope of what they'd been doing. His wife filed for divorce within the week, and word through the corporate network was that she'd sold the house in Medina and moved back to her family in Connecticut with the kids. Another set of people whose lives had been upended by two individuals who'd decided the rules were for other people. I crossed paths with Nate's ex-wife once, about 6 months after everything, in a coffee shop near my office. She recognized me before I recognized her, which made sense, since my face had been in the news almost as often as her husband's, and she stopped at my table with an expression I couldn't immediately read. "Ryan Coldwell," she said. "Not a question." "Mrs. Blake," I said, not sure what else to offer. "Catherine, please. I think formality is a bit beside the point at this stage." She asked if she could sit for a minute, and we talked for about 20, two people whose lives had been taken apart by the same source, comparing notes on what rebuilding looks like. She was doing better than I'd expected. Had reconnected with people who mattered. Was putting together a version of herself that didn't depend on her husband's career or his web of lies. She thanked me, which I hadn't anticipated, for bringing everything into the light. The not knowing was the worst part, she said, stirring coffee she barely touched. Suspecting, but never being certain. At least now I know exactly what I was dealing with. I told her I was glad she was moving forward, and I meant it. After she left, I sat there for a while thinking about everyone whose path had crossed with Emily and Nate's operation, all the people caught in the wreckage of two individuals who'd been so certain of their own cleverness. Harold Moore called me into his office a month after the gala, and I arrived expecting either a promotion or a careful conversation about the boundaries of my information gathering. What I got instead was something I hadn't anticipated, a handshake and an offer of partnership in a new security consulting firm he was launching as a North Peak subsidiary. "You manage this like a professional," he said, those gray eyes doing their usual assessment. "No unnecessary drama, no spectacle beyond what the situation required, just clean execution. That's a specific kind of skill. And I could use it." I told him I'd think it over, because I needed time to understand what kind of life I actually wanted to build now that the old one had been cleared away. The money was real and the opportunity was legitimate, but I wasn't sure I wanted to spend the rest of my working life excavating other people's deceptions. There's a tax on that kind of work, a slow erosion of your ability to take anything at face value. And I'd already paid more than enough of that tax. The divorce finalized on a Tuesday in April, 6 months after the night I first noticed Emily texting in the dark. The judge had moved efficiently once the financial crimes were factored into the asset picture, and Emily's efforts to claim half of everything had collapsed under the documented weight of her own stated intentions to leave once the money cleared. She walked away with her personal belongings and her legal bills. And I walked out of that courthouse feeling something I hadn't felt in longer than I could accurately remember, the very specific freedom of having something heavy lifted off you that you'd stopped noticing was there. I did take Harold's offer, eventually, after a few months of therapy and genuine reflection and the slow process of figuring out who Ryan Coldwell was supposed to be when he wasn't performing the role of loyal husband to someone who'd never intended to reciprocate the loyalty. The work is challenging and sometimes dark. But it also means other companies don't get blindsided the way North Peak nearly was, that other employees don't lose their careers to people willing to destroy them for a title, that other families don't get dismantled by people who decided the rules were optional. Emily reached out once, about a year after everything concluded, through an intermediary, because the restraining order was still active. She wanted to apologize, apparently. Wanted closure or forgiveness or whatever it is that makes the weight of bad choices feel lighter. I never responded. Not because I was still carrying the anger that had burned out long ago, leaving something quieter and more complicated in its place. But because there was genuinely nothing left to say. She'd made her choices. I'd made mine. The consequences had landed where they should. Going back over any of it would have been like pressing on a wound that had finally started to close. Last I heard, she was working at a small marketing firm somewhere in Arizona, starting from nothing and rebuilding whatever she could from what remained of her reputation. Some part of me hopes she finds her way, not for her sake particularly, but because the possibility of people actually changing is something worth believing in, even for people who spectacularly wasted their first opportunity. But that part of me is small and quiet, and it doesn't keep me awake the way her betrayal used to. These days, I sleep well. The bed doesn't feel like a contested territory anymore, it's just a place to rest. I've started seeing someone, a veterinarian with laugh lines around her eyes and a total inability to tell a convincing lie about anything. And sometimes I notice myself being surprised by how uncomplicated things can be when both people are genuinely invested. The house has changed too, new paint, new furniture, enough differences that it no longer functions as a monument to a marriage that failed. I kept a few things, practical items that were mine before Emily and remained mine after her. Almost everything we accumulated together is gone, donated, sold, or simply let go. Starting over at 41 wasn't the plan. But then again, almost nothing about the past year went according to any plan I'd made. And I've learned to be okay with that. Sometimes I think back to that night in the ballroom, the exact moment the floor dropped out from under everything, and I try to identify what I was actually feeling as I watched Emily's carefully built world come apart in real time. What I remember isn't triumph. It isn't revenge. It isn't even particular satisfaction. What I remember is exhaustion. The deep, bone-level tiredness of being finally, completely finished with a fight I'd never asked to have. She'd turned our marriage into a war. I'd won. But winning didn't feel like victory. It felt like walking away from a wreck you hadn't been driving. I'm not telling this story to cast myself as the hero or to reduce Emily to a villain, though she was certainly not the protagonist of our particular chapter. I'm telling it because people reveal who they are in the small moments long before they reveal it in the large ones. And the actual failure of my marriage wasn't the affair, or the fraud, or the very public unraveling at the gala. The real failure was all those smaller moments, the quiet dismissals, the accumulated disrespects, that I chose to let go because acknowledging them would have meant acknowledging that something was fundamentally broken. By the time she was writing me off as harmless in messages to her lover, she'd been treating me as harmless for years. And I'd allowed it, because the alternative required a kind of honesty I wasn't ready for. That's the thing I carry forward with me now, into this new chapter with its hard-earned clarity and its actual possibilities. Pay attention to the small things. Trust the part of you that says something is wrong. And never let anyone talk you into believing your own peace of mind matters less than their convenience. The rain is coming down again tonight, same Seattle rain that's been falling longer than anyone around here can remember. And I'm in my living room with a glass of whiskey and absolutely nothing left to prove to anyone. The silence in this house isn't heavy anymore. It's just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in after a storm has moved through and taken everything it came for. Tomorrow there will be work and complications and all the ordinary difficulty of living a real life in a world that doesn't factor in your feelings. But tonight, right now, there's just this, a man in his own space, at peace with his decisions, looking ahead at whatever's coming without fear or obligation or the slow accumulated weight of someone else's lies. And after everything that happened, honestly, that's more than enough.